Hello, my name is Richard Scrivens. I am a environmental studies major at CSU San Marcos, and for my environmental justice project I decided to make a documentary of some of my own personal experiences dealing with environmental justice I've had over my career in the military, while also gaining insight from professors that have done research along that, while also talking to another professor who actually worked in the EPA and also other organizations that help try to fight these environmental justice issues. The goals of my project is to enlighten you on the concepts and terminology that is used in environmental justice issues to help give you insight to the future that lays ahead of us.
My name is Bonnie Bade. I'm the founder of the anthropology department at Cal State San Marcos. I'm a medical anthropologist and an ethnobotanist. My research has focused on the health of migrant farm workers from southern Mexico, mostly indigenous people, women and children, maternal and child health.
Okay. So with that being said, what type of environmental justice have you personally experienced / seen along with your research?
Well, in working with farm workers, first of all, we have to know that that's a $50 billion a year agricultural industry in California. And so that industry is supported by migrant farm workers who are paid less than minimum wage. They make on an average about $5.69 an hour, or annually between $7,500 to about $15,000 a year. This is throughout California, and this is for working full-time as a farm worker. Most farm workers end up having to have maybe 8 to 10 jobs a year because they're going with the crops. So maybe they'll work the table grapes, and then that turns into the wine grapes, and then there's nothing for a couple of months, and then they maybe are doing the grape pruning, and then that turns into maybe they've got to migrate to another part of the state to work lettuce or to work some of the winter crops, and then they'll migrate back into the Central Valley, say, and they'll start working strawberries, and so they're working many different jobs, which means they don't have a steady employment, so they don't have health benefits, they don't have workers' rights benefits, they don't have days off and vacation days. They work hourly, or they work, well, if they do work hourly, it turns out to be fairly fair, but most of the time farm workers are paid on what's called a piece rate system. So the box of the giant crate of avocados that you pick, you're paid for that, or you're paid for each flat of strawberries you pick, or each flat of grapes you pick. And so when there's a lot of fruit, then pay maybe is minimum wage. But oftentimes, for example, in the tomato industry, they'll pick one field 3 times. So the first time you pick the field, you're making lots of money. The second time you pick the field, less money because there's less tomatoes available. By the time you're doing it the third time, there's very little money to be made. Okay. And so with regard to environmental justice, there's 2 factors that really influence the health of farm workers, and first and foremost is living conditions. So because housing is so expensive here in California, farm workers tend to live in really destitute conditions. They'll live either in, registered labor camps or non-registered labor camps, or they'll live in multiple families in one dwelling unit, usually like an apartment. So here in San Diego County, for example, you have a lot of people living in apartments. You have maybe 3 families living in a 2-bedroom apartment. So that affects health, that affects your living conditions. It's really hard to give your kids medicine. It's hard to make your meals when you're sharing the kitchen with 3 other families, 2 or 3 other families. So overcrowding is a huge problem. And those are for the people who are actually living in what's called a standard dwelling unit. But in farm worker, we find a lot of people living in what's called unconventional housing units. So that means maybe a tent in the front yard, maybe a trailer on the side of the house, maybe just living on the sides of orchards, underneath bridges. In the Central Valley, for example, many farm workers live in along rivers and along the aqueduct and along grapevines and the vineyards. In the Imperial County, we have a lot of farm workers. Imperial County is billions of dollars a year of agricultural produce, but you have a lot of farm workers living in trailers out in the middle of the desert. They don't have access to running water. They don't have access to toilets. And so a lot of sanitation and health issues surrounding living so close to the ground, so to speak. So living conditions is a huge problem. And this happens because growers are not required to provide housing for the workers. And so, and the rent is so expensive in California. So with a salary of, $7,000 to $15,000 a year, it's really hard to find a place to house your family. The other issue with regard to environmental justice that farm workers faced is constant pesticide exposure. And so even though there are a lot of laws in California to protect workers, the enforcement of those laws is a completely different issue. And so we have a lot of farm workers who will go out into fields that have just been sprayed, or they'll be in a field that's being sprayed while they're in the field picking. When we had all the fires, for example, here in San Diego County, everybody was evacuated from the 56 to the 78 except the farm workers who were working. The farm workers continued to work during the fires, and so they're exposed to all of that smoke. And so farm workers are exposed to radical temperature changes over the course of a day, many fungicides, pesticides, and herbicides over the course of a day. Oftentimes, if they're working in remote areas like in the Central Valley, there's no place to get lunch. And so the company lunch truck comes in and charges maybe $15 for a bag of Doritos and a frozen burrito and a Coke. And so food choices are not healthy as well. Also, farm workers tend to live in areas that are classified as food deserts. And so the only food source nearby might be a convenience store or a gas station quick stop shop. And so getting access to healthy foods like fresh fruits and vegetables is a real issue for farm workers.
Okay. With that being said, you've touched on the experiences kind of like with racism along this aspect of it. Can you explain like the experiences or whatever major observations you've seen with type of environmental racism towards them?
Well, that's really widespread. So, for example, my work started working with indigenous people from southern Mexico, and their physical stature is smaller. And so I would talk to growers and say, well, people are bending over and picking these blueberries, or bending over and they're picking the strawberries. But the answer would be, well, they're smaller and they really like this kind of work, and this is the kind of work they do at home. Their hands are smaller, and so they're more, conditioned to be able to delicately pick things like strawberries or blackberries or blueberries. And so there's been a lot of racial explanations for indigenous people, indigenous Mexicanos, indigenous Central Americans doing farm labor. I have noticed that the racism even is within the Mexican and Latino population itself. So because there's a newer wave of indigenous people in the farm labor force. The previous wave of laborers came from central Mexico. They were Spanish-speaking mestizo Mexicanos. And they oftentimes will not work in the same field as people from Oaxaca because they say they have a lot of derogatory terms that they might use to refer to the indigenous communities that are coming up and working in the agricultural regions now. And so I've seen that play out where you have mestizo Mexicano farm workers becoming foremen, for example. And so there's a lot of sexual assault in the workplace. There's a lot of racial assault in the workplace. And there's really no recourse for those who are being assaulted because they're often here without legal documents. And so they fear the authorities and they're not going to go to the police or they're not going to go to the owner of the company with this problem because they get shamed or they get fired.
All right. Do you see or feel that there's a way forward with environmental justice that could lead to a better future?
I do. I've always thought that farm labor should be a real occupation, just like computer scientists or people who work in laboratories or people who even work in grocery stores. I mean, they have health benefits and they have, it's a real occupation as opposed to a piece by piece, day by day type of occupation. So you have this $50 billion a year agricultural industry that really depends on this very cheap labor force for whom they don't have to provide any benefits at all. And so I think that one way would be to elevate farm labor to a true occupation that that enjoys the benefits of other occupations, full-time jobs.
Okay. How do you feel that this could be enacted most likely?
There would have to be legislation, of course. The problem that the farm labor has is that we know that most of the workers are not legally here. But because of the lobbying of this $50 billion a year industry, they're able to somehow continue to have this workforce that's very marginalized, socially, economically, and politically marginalized workforce, which behooves them because then they are able to pay less and make their profits through labor.
How has the conditions improved since you conducted your research towards the environmental justice aspect?
Okay. Well, as I was saying, California has a lot of really great rules in the field. So, for example, if you're working in a field, there should be a porta potty or bathrooms available. There should be a place to wash your hands. There should be a place to dry your hands. There should be a place to have a break and eat your food that's not in the field. And we have all of these laws in California, but we don't have people to enforce those laws. And so throughout California, there might be 2 officials who are charged with enforcing labor laws in the agricultural industry. And that's, like I said, a $50 billion a year industry, hundreds of fields of tomatoes and hundreds of fields of grapes and hundreds of fields of cantaloupes and broccoli. And there's simply not enough official representation to be able to maintain those laws. And so what you find is that you go out in any typical field and there is no porta potty. Or if there's a porta potty, there's no toilet paper. Or there's no water available for workers to drink. Or when they do take a break, there's nowhere to sit. So they have to sit in the field with the pesticides. There's no place for them to wash their hands, so they're eating their food with pesticides on their hands. I have not seen this change. I have been working since 1987 with farm workers, and this has not changed. And as a matter of fact, it was that way 20 and 30 years before I started working. So all of the efforts of the United Farm Workers and Cesar Chavez, they accomplished a lot for a very small amount of time. And then those workers cycled out of agriculture and were replaced by new workers in agriculture who didn't know the rules and didn't know that they could claim benefits. And so agriculture has managed to constantly have their workforce cycling out of agriculture and being replaced by a new, more economically destitute, more politically unsophisticated group that is willing to work for less and in the poor conditions in which they work. So I haven't seen any improvements at all.
Is there anything else that you feel that people should know about environmental justice and the concepts that haven't been discussed yet?
Well, this is a little bit outside of the purview of what we've been talking about, but with regards to pesticide, I mean, pesticides are sprayed constantly on top of us all the time. Right here in San Diego County, I did a study with some of my students, and we were working with tribal people who are basket weavers, who are using California native plants to weave their baskets. And one of the basket weavers, who belongs to the California Indian Basket Weavers Association, mentioned, well, 6 of us have tongue or throat cancer right now. And we're thinking that it's because we're exposed to pesticides when we gather the natural plants out in the natural landscape, out in the wilderness, or on BLM land. And so I ordered a bunch of pesticide testing kits and got 3 students to work with this woman who was from the San Luis Rey Band of Luiseno Indians. And she took us out to all of the unknown gathering sites where they gather things like juncus or deer grass, and we tested for pesticides. We found 100%. Every single site that we went to, we found organophosphates and other pesticides on the plants themselves that were being used. We found it in water. We found it on campus. We did the testing on campus in my ethnobotany garden for the anthropology department. We found pesticides everywhere. So we looked into it and found that the County of San Diego sprays every summer throughout North County on a regular basis to prevent the propagation of mosquitoes. And so there is a website that says, oh, we're going to spray on this day, but nobody looks at the website. Nobody knows the website even exists, and nobody knows that they're actually being sprayed by neurotoxins on a regular basis throughout the summer. That's not racial. That's everybody.
Okay.
Right. I'm Ann Dabb, and I am a professor of environmental studies and philosophy at Cal State San Marcos University.
Okay. To start off here, what type of environmental justice experience have you personally got to experience throughout your career?
So I'll start way back when I worked for the Ohio Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, and I actually lived adjacent to a community that I worked in that was an inner city Columbus neighborhood on the east side of Columbus in Ohio, and adjacent to the zip code where I lived and not far from where I worked at the EPA, there was another zip code that was predominantly African American and lower socioeconomic status, and they also had 17 major polluting industries within the same zip code. So there were very high incidents of respiratory illnesses, especially among kids, a lot of asthma, and there was also a very, very active and committed and very sophisticated activist group that was mainly led by African American women. A lot of them identify themselves as moms, and that's how they kind of got into their environmental justice work. And in my work at the EPA, I worked for the Public Information Center and in the Right to Know initiative. So I worked with urban communities in Columbus, and I also worked with Amish communities in rural areas outside of Columbus and other parts of Ohio. So I saw environmental justice injustice and also the attempts at action really deeply in that urban African American community. And then in the Amish community, as a kind of contrast, there was not a lot of awareness about issues that were impacting those communities, which had to do with agricultural runoff and non-point source pollution from agriculture. So sort of shifting back to the 17 major polluting industries in one zip code, what happened was, one of the challenges was when that community group came to the EPA and they were really trying to work with the industries, and most of the industries that were polluting in the area wanted to be good neighbors. The problem was each of those industries were, for the most part, meeting all the EPA requirements for emissions or pollutants. So they were following the letter of the law, but because there was such a concentration of industry in this one area, it was causing a lot of public health and environmental issues. So there was a sort of a struggle going on between the community trying to protect the environment, and also with a lot of public health concerns, especially around children's health. And the EPA was saying, well, we can't really do anything on a regulatory basis because they're meeting all their requirements. And so as part of my job, I actually ended up, not exactly for that reason, I went back to grad school as part of it, but I left the EPA and worked for an umbrella group that worked with a lot of environmental nonprofits. And through that group, after I left the EPA, I worked with the EPA, those community groups, and the university where I eventually went to grad school, which was Ohio State University. And we started a collaboration that actually allowed the communities to work with the EPA, to work with university researchers, and the industries, and there were some implementation of better. Some of the companies actually voluntarily installed better scrubbers and better controls, pollution and emission controls, above and beyond what they had to do for the EPA to try to ameliorate some of the pollution concerns and public health concerns in that community. So that I thought was interesting, and a contrast in that job, as I also was working around Right to Know in an Amish community where there was a very high incidence of childhood cancers that was correlated, not necessarily caused by, but correlated with the pollution of drinking water, and a lot of issues with agricultural runoff. And in that community, because of their faith and other cultural aspects of that community, they really saw, even though they were having a really disproportionately high incidence of things like childhood leukemia, there was in the culture they saw it as the will of God, and they weren't really looking at or thinking about agricultural runoff. So we actually, through the Right to Know Commission at the EPA and the Public Information Center, we actually worked on public education campaigns really tailored to that specific community, and really had to also address some or learn some cultural competency to work in the Amish community. So I had those two contrasting things going on at the same time, which have both addressed environmental justice and specifically public health issues.
With that, like how you talked about the community next door
Yeah.
out there, Did you find any type of like environmental racism or anything else that was part of that?
Because the community, and it was in, so that part of Columbus, which is, it's called Old Town East and the east side of Columbus, there was a lot of gentrification happening at the same time. So historically, black communities and neighborhoods that had vibrant sort of African American culture for many years, for decades, were people, there was sort of the zip codes that they didn't have all the polluting industries, but that were still part of those historic black neighborhoods. Those were being gentrified, and it pushed more people who had lived in those newly gentrifying areas into the more polluted zip codes. So and it was largely predominantly African American communities. So I think there was definitely an aspect of, in that instance, of environmental racism, and just the siting of all of these industries and factories and waste sites were all within one relatively small urban zip code. So.
With your own words, what's environmental racism to you?
Environmental racism is the not always deliberate, but often deliberate for a number of institutional and historical reasons. The citing of undesirable sites, so it could be hazardous waste sites, incinerators, landfills, in predominantly minority neighborhoods or areas.
Major concepts did you find to be a trend amongst most major environmental justice issues?
Oh, yeah, definitely. So those were not, so within the EPA, those terms, so environmental justice was a concept that we talked about, and environmental racism was a concept that came up, but that wasn't really in the culture of the EPA, in that bureaucracy. There really wasn't a lot of discussion of institutional racism and hegemonic systems and power and how that works. And so it's interesting, and it's not surprising that in that kind of government bureaucracy, the focus was on more sort of mundane concepts, but environmental justice was definitely a concept that we sort of discussed regularly, I guess, in that environment, but in the context of environmental justice as sort of equitably distributing harms, rather than a definition that I prefer, which is eliminating the harms for everyone, not just distributing them more equitably. And I think that is, I mean, the EPA in general, the EPA's concept of environmental justice has to do with sort of sharing harms, not locating them in, based on race, economic status, ethnicity, but sort of spreading them out. So I think that was part, within that institution, there were real limitations to how some of the concepts around environmental justice really were expressed or addressed, which is part of why I left the EPA, because I had enough experience and saw the real practical issues of not being able to address issues of environmental justice when from the EPA, from the sort of bureaucratic perspective, while all of these industries are meeting their guidelines, there was no way of really monitoring or addressing the cumulative effect on those communities. So I found myself actively working with and then getting a job in the nonprofit sector, so I could really more could address those issues a little. So I moved to the nonprofit sector, and then went back to grad school, where I was steeped in like talking about hegemony and power and institutions and. But I could talk a little bit. My first master's degree, the first round of grad school, I worked on issues that involved environmental justice in India. I guess my other experiences in environmental justice were when I was working on my master's degree. My research and fieldwork was around the ecological and sociological disruptions around large-scale hydroelectric dam projects in central India. So I was working with a group that was trying to prevent the damming of the Narmada River in particular, and there were a lot of the environmental justice issues there revolved around indigenous communities that lived in the river valleys that were going to be flooded by the dam. So that was another aspect of really engaging with environmental justice issues and really engaging with the sort of the scientific community and the activist community around the what was happening ecologically in those regions, but also the social disruptions from those projects. And some of that work was very successful in preventing or delaying or shutting down dam projects, and some of them weren't. But it was a very sort of stark example in those instances. If a dam was built or was starting to be built, what the end result was flooding out a village of Adivasi or indigenous people who may have been in that region continuously for 2,000 years and had very, very deep roots in the community and the local ecology, and there were just layer upon layer of social disruption as well as ecological destruction of those really those communities.
What do you feel the way forward is for environmental justice that will lead us to a better future?
Wow, that's a good question. Well, I think there is, fortunately now, more of a recognition, a more widespread understanding of the concepts of environmental injustice and environmental racism. I think the more people understand those concepts, and there's more education around how to mediate. I think for me, even going back, many, many years when I was working for the EPA, seeing what can that sort of power when you have a committed and really well organized and community groups, when there can be coalitions formed and collaboration between, in my case, it was a university community with the local community that was really being affected by environmental racism, and then getting government bodies or other environmental groups involved, and then working directly with the industries that are causing the problems. That I think there's some really powerful collaboration. So I think an understanding that these aren't isolated issues, and there needs to be collaboration, and sometimes collaboration between unlikely partners. I think that gives me hope. Is going forward is more awareness, more understanding, and more collaboration, cooperation to address some of the root causes of environmental injustice and environmental racism, and not just trying to address the aftermath. The other things, I mean, if you look at what's happened in Flint, Michigan, the fact that there were actual arrests made in that case, even though, you know, Flint, Michigan is sort of the tip of the iceberg around things like lead, and that particular host of environmental justice issues, but that there, through litigation, that is also an area that is providing meaningful resistance and addressing some environmental policy issues right now. So I've worked with a friend and colleague of mine, Majora Carter, who's from the South Bronx, and she started an organization called Sustainable South Bronx to address very specific instances of environmental racism in her community in the South Bronx, and she won a MacArthur Genius Grant for that. So I feel like having, I think another way, and the way that environmental injustice has always been addressed is through really savvy organizing and awareness coming from within communities that are affected, and I think that's another. And then those communities having good allies outside of the community.
Is there anything that you think people don't know about environmental justice or concepts that should be brought up and discussed that aren't already out there?
And I think even in our discussion here, I was focusing more on some of the outcomes than the underlying causes. So I think what really needs to be addressed are the root causes of the injustice that is at the heart of all environmental justice issues and environmental racism. So I think looking at the sort of historical precedents and looking at the institutional racism and injustice at a systemic level, I think those things really need to be discussed and addressed more directly, because I think sometimes we look at the result of those kinds of systems and institutions and try to address those things without addressing the root causes, and I think that's really what's at the sort of foundation of environmental injustice. This would get into a whole other discussion, but I would put patriarchy as one of the foundations of a sort of globally all kinds of injustice, but really I think it's directly reconnected to many forms of environmental injustice. I think environmental degradation globally tends to impact women and girls disproportionately. I mean, I think racism in general, I mean, racism is sort of is another one of the roots of environmental injustice. So I would say racism and patriarchy would be good places to start. And I think too, sorry, I keep talking. I think too, one of the really pressing areas of focus around environmental justice is around the climate, current climate catastrophe or climate emergency that we're in right now, because we know that the parts of the world and the communities that are maybe least able to address successfully address mitigation and adaptation to climate change are also the communities that are going to bear the brunt of the sort of worst effects, and they'll see those effects sooner than other parts of the world. And the parts of the world that are responsible for greenhouse gas emissions and not addressing, 30, 40 years ago, not starting to really address issues around fossil fuel use and consumption, that certain communities will suffer, but they're not the communities at the root of some of the worst causes of the climate emergency. So I think that's another area that we really needs to be addressed. I think issues around migration and refugees from a climate catastrophe will be is now, but will become an even greater issue of environmental justice.
When you're thinking of environmental justice issues, what do you think, if you had to pick any type of concept you've ever heard, is probably the biggest main topic that leads to all environmental justice issues? Part of my experiences through Iraq and Afghanistan is intersectionality. I was able to see a lot of issues of polluting, people just dumping at random locations, not properly disposing of things, not realizing the consequences, how it affects everybody as a whole, which leads to more health and medical issues and complications with births and everything else like that. At the same time, a good example of how people don't really pay attention about dumping of waste. We ended up building a little miniature base for the Afghan National Army up in eastern province of Afghanistan. And while we were there, we were wondering why we were all starting to get like dysentery and health issues that were affecting us. And we noticed that the local Afghan National Military was washing their dishes in the same river that they were utilizing as a restroom, which is, as we know, a bad business to do. But they were actually using the restroom upstream and washing their dishes downstream, not realizing that it's polluting the waters and contaminating not just only themselves but everybody else down the streams and down the rivers. At the same time, their mining practices that they have there are not actually looking out for the best interests of the people, trying to protect them. They have a lot of things where they inhale all the dust and everything else from that, which causes issues for them trying to make a living where the society has pushed them away. For examples, in Iraq and everything else like that, I know the VA has personally talked about they don't know the long-term effects yet to burning trash pits and everything else that we've utilized over there. However, during our recent studies that we've already acknowledged in the United States and other European countries and Asia, that incendiary plants burning our trash and plastics causes cancers, increased cancer rates and birth defects and things of that nature of the biotoxins that are released into the air, which affects everybody. After taking this course, the biggest takeaway I ended up getting from this that stems everything else is that the colonialism / hegemonic state of our society leads / controls how we dictate what is good and bad and who's going to get the blunt of the toxins that are released. I'm glad I was able to have the opportunity to talk to both Professor Ann Dabb and Professor Bonnie Bade, and they gave their time and effort towards this video. I appreciate every bit of insight that they have, and I hope you can use this to better our whole world as a whole. Thank you.